Okay. There's always that lag, so let's hang for just a moment. We are ready to begin.
Awesome. So hi and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us so much for tonight's community engagement session, where we'll be discussing the new proposed policy for gender inclusion. Tonight I have with me Assistant Superintendent Nick Lightfoot. Nick will be presenting us with some background on the policy, as well as here to help facilitate any questions and answers. I also have Laura Jensen, who heads up our LGBTQ plus support groups and is our liaison across the district, as well as Hopkins Junior High, North Junior High reading teacher. So thank you both for being here so much and helping out with the conversation in the community. I'd also like to say thank you in advance to our Equity and Inclusion Student Advisory Council. Much of this policy was drafted with their input and assistance, and they have helped us dramatically with the policy that we are going to be discussing this evening. With that, Dr. Lightfoot, would you like to share a little bit of background on how we got to where we're at today?
Absolutely, more than happy to. Appreciate the words of encouragement and support, and thanks and appreciation for all of those that have been involved with bringing the policy forward to where it stands now. As we were doing our monitoring committee work, which is the monthly work of the board to review policies and make sure that we have policies and practices that are in alignment with our community and with our board goals and outcomes, one of the items that was forthcoming from our scholars was the distinct need that our scholars were experiencing related to gender inclusion, and the expressed desire that we heard from our GSA students, from our transgendered students who were expressing the need clearly that they felt that there was not a space in our policies that clearly identified the policy toward gender inclusion. And as we have been continually evolving with our work over time, the monitoring committee felt that it was really in the best interest of the district to serve our scholars well, to look toward places that had begun gender inclusion policy work, what had been produced throughout the state of Minnesota, and to utilize those as templates to begin from, so that we could localize our work, make sure that we had scholar voice as part of the process, go through our general policy and legal review, and then eventually bring it forward to the board. As had been noted in the workshop on Tuesday, this policy has begun its work and its inceptions around 2019. And as part of that work, it was then really moved forward to begin more dialogue with our student groups. So at that point in time, a monitoring committee member, Director Bouchard, now Chair Bouchard, brought that information forward to our scholars as we looked at beginning with some templates that we had pulled together, and then starting to look at the work and crafting the policy and crafting the language to ensure that we had student voice as part of our process. That work has been ongoing and back and forth with the monitoring committee. We are now in the stage where we are looking at it in first read, still in draft form before it is finalized with the board. So the importance of this evening is making sure that we're bringing our work to date forward to the community for additional input and insight, as well to make sure that we are being mindful of anything that we might have missed, other thoughts that community and scholars might have, for us to continually develop and be vigilant about making sure that our work promotes our core value of authentic inclusivity and establishes the vigilant equity that really are central in our Vision 2031 core values. So as part of that, we were very fortunate to engage our scholar groups in partnership with Laura Jensen. And as Director Peterson has identified, Laura was a key partner in that process and has some additional information for our consideration before we take additional comments and questions from the community that have either already been submitted or will be submitted during our time this evening. So with that, Laura, welcome, and thank you for your time this afternoon, this early evening, to help us understand what input we've seen so far, and hopefully some of the comments that you thought were most relevant as we've made our way through our work with our scholars.
Thank you, Nick. As Nick and Katie said, I'm Laura Jensen. I use she, her pronouns, and I've been working in the Hopkins district for the last 5 years. And I've had the honor and good fortune to work with the Gender and Sexuality Alliances at both West and North junior highs. I've worked for the last 20 years with school-based GSAs in my career as a teacher. And this gender inclusion policy is really all about our students. It's embracing who they are and supporting their authentic selves. The GSAs at all of the secondary schools and up at Hopkins High School, the transgender student group, are not only really excited about this policy and feel very seen and heard, they also were able to give input very early in the stages of what mattered to them, what was important to them, and what would be useful and helpful. Gendering, gender assumptions, gender stereotypes, and categorizing based on gender are pervasive in schools and society. And often folks think of two genders, male and female, that binary gender. But now it's widely accepted that gender is a spectrum. And some of us who are cisgender, we identify as the gender we were assigned at birth. I was born and the doctor said it's a girl. And the identity that I still use today is female. But some folks who are transgender, who embrace a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth, or gender fluid, gender queer, or gender nonconforming. In other words, they embrace a much wider range of genders and gender expressions that often don't match the gender assigned at birth. For them, school can be a challenging place. And so how wonderful, right, that we have students who are coming into their own identities and embracing their wonderfulness in all of its different forms, including gender. Students most talked about in the GSAs in the transgender group, the impact of being misgendered, which is referring to a student by a gender that they don't identify with. If this happens once per day at school, it can be challenging. But if it happens repeatedly during a school day, a school week, a school year, it starts to really damage that student's identity and is really a struggle for them to cope with that constant misidentification of who they truly are. And what I love about Hopkins schools is wanting to be vigilantly equitable in all ways and embracing who our students are and their identities. Whether intentional or not, that misgendering can feel very disorienting to students or dismissive of their gender or identity, or hurtful, or even feel like an attack on who they are. That impact versus intent. What I love about Hopkins schools is that I work with some of the most caring, thoughtful, well-intentioned colleagues that one could really ever imagine. They're amazing. They want to do the right thing. They want to be positive influences on all of the students in their classes or all the students that they encounter in the various roles that everyone works at in this district. And this is where a policy becomes really crucial and in some cases life-saving for students. The policy supports all of our staff receiving the appropriate professional development to respond to each student according to his, her, or their gender identity. Staff want to learn the best way to interact with students, what language to use, and how best to interact with all of our scholars. The policy in real and practical ways makes sure that we have facilities, including bathrooms, locker rooms, and all other facilities that affirm students' identities. The policy makes sure that our intent and our impact match each other, thereby supporting all of our young folks in our district. We know for transgender and gender non-binary youth whose identity and pronouns are respected and affirmed, their mental health is much better. We know that their risk for suicide is cut in half. So this is truly also a mental health issue for our students who happen to identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. We also know that nationally, 61% of transgender and non-binary youth report being actually prevented or discouraged from using facilities at their schools that correspond with their gender identity. And that's not who we are at Hopkins schools, and it's not who we want to be. And policies just always ensure that we are equitable and compassionate and supporting who our students are. When I have seen students supported in their gender identity, they flourish. One student who I had as a 7th grader on my roster was listed as female, had a female name. I had this student for a semester in 7th grade. They seemed somewhat depressed, withdrawn, and unhappy. 2 years later, I met the student again at a different school as a 9th grader. This time, the student's chosen name was listed on the roster, the correct pronouns were on the roster, and at first, I literally did not recognize this student as someone I had had 2 years ago, and then it dawned on me. This was my former 7th grader, and now he really was who he was meant to be. He had school support, he had family support. Much of that weight had been lifted off of his shoulders. He was very active in the GSA. He really came into his own. He seemed like a different person. It's still possible that he would be misgendered or struggle with mental health issues in the future, but it is less likely so because he was supported in Hopkins schools, and the difference was literally astonishing. And this is what every student deserves. Just this last Wednesday, I was walking down the hallway at North Junior High. A student was waiting outside of our 2 gender-neutral bathrooms at North. Both of these bathrooms were being occupied. The student just patiently waited. There were gendered bathrooms just down the hallway, a very short walk away, but those were not the bathrooms that the student wanted or needed. The wait was fine. The bathroom seemingly insignificant is not. It shows that we affirm our students and who they are. Students have the right to use the bathroom and all other facilities that correspond to their gender identity and to who they are. In talking to the GSA kids and the students in the transgender high school group, they want to make sure that they have access to safe facilities that correspond to their gender. They don't want to use a staff bathroom or a bathroom they have to go get a key for, or a bathroom down the hallway to the shipping dock behind the cafeteria, or a bathroom in the nurse's office. They're not sick. They just want to use a bathroom that matches their identity. They want to be responded to using the correct pronouns, and they want their correct names being used. And at Hopkins schools, again, our staff really are so welcoming and affirming and want to do the right thing. So this policy allows that professional development to happen, the supports to happen for staff at all levels, as well as then for our students. And those of you sitting here listening to the Community Engagement Forum and maybe about to comment or ask questions, for those of you who you know what your gender identity is, imagine having others trying to convince you otherwise. Here at Hopkins Schools, we want to honor and trust and believe our students when they tell us who they are, support them in their journey of discovering what their identity is. This policy ensures that we're moving forward towards that level of support and coming alongside our students in loving, affirming, and trusting ways. And just like we are part of racial justice work right now, being part of the work that affirms our students' gender identities is also about racial justice work. We know that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx transgender students and people in general are at incredibly high risk for violence against them. Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist, writes, if we are not raging at the persisting murders of Black trans people, if we don't value them with the same conviction we value Black cisgender men, then we are not being anti-racist. This is a policy that will not only support and affirm our students, as well as many families that are part of our district where one or both parents identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. It is a policy that will support all of our students across all cultural and racial backgrounds. This policy will send a message of support to our students and to our families in our district, that we support them, love them, will protect them, and will do what's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate, as we said before, all of your work, insights, and engagement in bringing us to the space where we are now, and the continual vigilance as we've had dialogue about how policies evolve and really kind of hopefully are designed to serve those in need in the ways that we hope to be vigilant with our equity with. So with that, we have some comments that have already been submitted, so we'll make sure that we address those. And for those that are listening who may have not filled out comments or might like to provide any additional questions for us to attend to, a link to the comment form can be found on the main website. Scroll down to Hopkins News, and that is available for you as well. So we might begin with what we've received so far as perhaps the next step, Director Peterson.
Absolutely. So, and I apologize if I go off, but as I switch screens, I think my camera might go wonky. But one of the questions, actually, it was a series of 3 questions that we received from Dave Edwards. And I just want to express my appreciation for Dave's comments. He's from Transforming Families, Minnesota, also part of the Minnesota Transgender Health Coalition and HRC's Welcoming Schools. And this is exactly why we do these types of scenarios, is to get comments, questions, engagement from people in our community that can really help shape this policy. So his first comment and question is in regards to Section 6. There's language using the phrase consistently asserted at school. What are the criteria for defining consistency and assertion? What school staff make these decisions? It would read better to have the statement changed to aligns with their gender identity and remove the consistency asserted at school language entirely. And I'll let whoever, Laura or Nick, that if you'd like to respond to that. I will say a big part of the Policy and Monitoring Committee's work has been ensuring that our language is carefully assessed. And so I would appreciate any input that either Nick or Laura you may have to this question.
I'll do the non-legal answer and then let Nick take the more formal legal answer. I do agree with Dave Edwards on this. I think aligns with gender identity is a better benchmark to have for this versus trying to get into the semantics and judgment of consistently asserted.
Agreed. I think that's a really insightful review of the language that we have so far. As we were working with our board and having conversations on Tuesday, we said we really wanted to have the general approach of the policy be as inclusive as we can and be as broadly serving as we can. And I think the language suggestion really does allow for that and really does not impact, and in fact, probably makes it much more clear in that statement as well.
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you both for your response, and Dave for that really fantastic input on our language. The next comment and question that comes from Dave is in section 3, language is needed to make sure student needs related to social transitions are more clearly defined. Corrections could include school staff will not control the timeline or manner of transition for transgender and non-binary students. Schools sometimes attempt to impose criteria around the right time for student transitions or require a transition meeting or planning session in order for the student to speak openly about who they are in K-12 schools. The option should be given, but not required. Dr. Lightfoot, I think I'm going to ask you a little bit on this one because I remember speaking directly to this language and ensuring that it was truly a student choice and a student-led choice. So I'm wondering if we can actually go a little bit further with that language.
Certainly, I'm happy to respond. And Laura, anything else in addition that you would think as well? Again, I think the comments are insightful, and another component that we really are looking toward is serving students well and being an educational component for those that are charged with implementing the policy. And as we think about part of the next phase of policy, which really is implementation and training and development on the policy, one of the things that came to mind from the comment that was submitted was this also is another training element, because I think clearly language that we can include that directly does speak to the control of the experience and the lived experience value that individuals bring to this has to be part of the policy. And I believe the language as it is so far, certainly to have further discussion with the monitoring committee and the board, as suggested, asks us to look toward that within that policy section. So in my mind, I think that holds high value for us as we look at being clear that there is no school set timeline. And in fact, that action would be more harmful with its impact, even if it does come, and I appreciated the words earlier, Laura, with good intent. We really must write and think about the policy as its impact. Would be a couple opening thoughts that I'd offer, and additional comments or thoughts, Laura?
I agree with everything you said, and I think the spirit of the policy is really about that student-led choice and just making sure the language fleshes that out.
Awesome. Thanks both. And one clarification too, that I think is important for any community members is when we talk about policy versus implementation, that really the work is going to come with the implementation of this policy, and we'll continue to call on our community members, our staff members, our student advisory councils, but it will, along the lines of our staff guide, training and development for our staff. That's really how we're going to put this policy into action, and I think that making sure that the language is broad enough that those guidelines can be supportive is super important. So the next question from Mr. Edwards is, what local resources from the Twin Cities transgender community did you draw from to decide on the scope and content of the definitions section? Can you speak to the process that was used to decide what to include and how to define these terms? Language is consistently evolving. What steps did you take to ensure that the district is using language trans folks want to use, and to talk about their identities? And I think just really briefly, I think, and Nick, you've been involved in this for many years, and Laura, you can speak to it as well, but I know that much of the information in the policy as far as language that we used was really guided by our student advisory council, and most of the input came from the students themselves. But Nick and Laura, I'll let you speak to that as well, as because I know there's it's much broader than that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in to start, and then Laura, you can speak more to the process and the feedback that we gathered, and with full recognition that we have something to work from, which was what we looked at the base kind of policy template was really kind of original language that has been used around the state and other policies that other school districts had, that we use that as our beginning point from what work had been done in other places and mirroring and matching that as other spaces had done their work as well. We then brought that forward to our scholars for additional input. And of course, other agencies and support as well would certainly be welcomed in the process. I think our primary focus was to hear from our scholars about what they had wanted and to be thinking about how we could build that into it so that their voice would be part of training, would be part of the development. And Laura, I know as we've had some additional conversations, we might look toward additional agencies, GLSEN, other educational associations that really do support our scholars, might be additional spaces that we can look into. And certainly seeking additional input from the trans community and other agencies in Minnesota and the area to make sure that we have it right, or if not, other additional suggestions that they might ask us to consider as well. Additional thoughts on that and the process that we used, Laura?
Yeah, I think you really explained that very, very well. I remember sitting with a group of students going through some of that before the pandemic. So, this has been in process for quite some time. And as we know, language is constantly evolving and changing. And even just in my role as a GSA advisor, I hear students using language differently this school year than even last school year. So it's constantly changing and evolving. I would say as well, a lot of this has come from our students. And then probably from several other various resources. I think GLSEN actually probably has been a resource we've used. Gender Spectrum is another resource that we have used, and probably some other ones as well. And I think that's also the challenge of policy, right? We want policy typed up and written down, and it's challenging when the language is changing and evolving very, very quickly.
I think the other insight, as I was going back and looking at the feedback that we received from our scholars, one of the key standout points for me was statements that this needs to be accessible language. It needs to be language we can relate to. It can't be the technical kinds of really rigid language that makes it feel like this is impersonal, or it doesn't matter, or it's just out of a dictionary. And so I know that that's been another consideration of how we think about that, and making sure that the policy really is accessible to those, to make sure that we have included their voice in it too.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Just a quick note too. There was a little bit of chatter on the side here that people are having a hard time finding our form to submit your comments and questions. Just a reminder to anybody who's watching, if you go to the actually to the district page, under district, there's school board. And then under school board, there's some dates. And I actually think there's probably a quicker way to find this. This is, I find everything on the school board page, but there's actually a link in the description that says a link to this form. And if you click on the word form, that'll take you to it. But I do know that, so in addition to myself and Vice Chair Shannon Andreessen, we have a third board member who sits on our policy and monitoring committee. His name is John Kuhl. And John has been, he's unfortunately detained due to technical issues this evening to get on, but he did submit a question. So I did want to share with you guys just a little input from John Kuhl, which is, due to major technical issues, I'm unable to be on the feed, but this policy hits close to home for me. My 16-year-old daughter deals with issues almost every time she uses the bathroom in public. When I discussed this policy with her, we both reared up and hugged. This is important. There's also a comment from another parent as well, Anne, who thanked us and fully supported the policy. And so these types of support comments are very important. There was one additional question that popped in, and it is, here we go. My son identifies male, but often wears female typical clothing, dresses. How can the policy support his use of the boys' bathroom without harassment from students that he is going into the wrong bathroom? Can there be an education component in the policy related to helping the full student population support these kids in their choices? So there isn't an exhausting process to handle each and every case, but rather a more comprehensive approach.
Wow, I loved that question. So really glad that parent submitted that. I think that policy, right, often is that we think of it as that kind of legalese language, and it's what we're required to do. And I think that good policy fleshes out in just support and seeking justice and equity for folks. And I think that a lot of times policy comes either first or at the same time as also changes in climate and culture. And I think what I'm hearing in that question is that reflection in climate and culture for various gender expressions. And in my mind, this policy will really help to also transform climate and culture in our whole school district. It is not just simply, right, that a student identifies one way or the other and can use X or Y or Z bathroom or facilities, but it really is a transformative policy that really starts to move into how we think, how we view each other, how we view gender as in a much more expansive way. So it's almost like it's both a trickle up and a trickle down effect that policy can have on climate and culture.
Thank you, Laura. I think the other thing that this reminded me of, Katie, was the conversation that we had and heard from presentation in Tuesday's workshop from our equity committee that we have with our scholars. And very clearly what they were recommending was how we are inclusive in our curriculum components, inclusive of looking at our elementary curriculum, our junior high curriculum, our high school curriculum, that really infuses at age appropriate times the important information that I think is identified specifically in this question that really relates to, okay, how can we educate? How can we inform so that we can help to shape the climate and the culture and develop that welcoming, inclusive climate culture that our scholars experience when they're engaged in their learning in the Hopkins schools? I don't know if you can speak to anything, Katie, about conversations that committee or that group had as well, because I think one of the key elements there is that's all scholar driven.
It is, and it is Vice Chair Andreessen that really heads up the work around our Equity Inclusion Student Advisory Council. So I don't want to speak out of turn on that, but I do know that the participation that we have in that council and the breadth of representation that we have from our student body is so key, and it's been so helpful. I mean, beyond just the drafting of this policy, talking about our curriculum reform, both from a racial and equity perspective, as well as, making sure that when we're doing our health curriculum, that we're not breaking students out by gender. And a lot of that stuff around that's being given to us directly from the mouths of our scholars. And it's driving forward change in really tangible ways. And so that's super important. Really quickly, I'm just going to pop over and check and see if we've gotten any more questions in our form while we're chatting. We do have one more. I'm writing to support this life-saving policy. This is about our kids and ensuring they can, it refreshes apparently as comments come in, sorry. This is about our kids and ensuring they can be who they are. We need to create an environment where all of our kids feel welcome. Transgender kids have a much higher suicide rate, so this affirming policy is very much needed. In addition, this policy will support our staff. This is important given what happened in Minnetonka with Mr. Peruco, who was not supported from his principal and his board. We need to support our staff, and this policy enables us to do so. If we want equity, we need to work to achieve this and set the example for our kids. I mean, it's so great to be getting these types of messages from our community. We do have one other comment, but before I move on to that one, did either Nick or Laura, did you have anything to share with that as well?
I just really appreciate community engagement in this. And Hopkins Schools does represent sort of a really diverse geographic range here in the West Metro, and I agree. I think it's life-saving policy, and I think it really says out loud what we already believe, but it is really important to formalize what we believe into policy. So I think yes, and I'm really grateful for that community member.
And I also appreciate that it calls out that while we have a start, we still have work to do. We aren't going to get it all right, all just with this document right at this time. We have a start, and it feels great to have the start, and we need to continue that work, and we need to deepen the education that comes along with it, and make sure that now after we have the policy that we are following through with the implementation and the responsibility at the administrative level to help it go further into the organization and make the changes that really speak to that life-saving quality that we're hoping to drive.
Agreed. There is another comment that's come through. Let me just refresh and make sure. Yep. So that one is, could you talk more about the staff development and other measures to help staff know how to make this policy a daily practice? I feel we need to make sure we reach club advisors, paras, coaches, and all others in addition to teachers.
Yeah, and just like Nick just said, like this is our starting point, and just like language evolves, this will constantly be evolving, and we will constantly need to be cycling back and doing professional development. And I absolutely agree that it's at every level, from bus drivers, custodial staff, paraprofessionals, administrative staff, teachers in the classroom, teachers on special assignment, administrators, everyone. And I think that often we typically start in school districts. I think most school districts typically start at that teacher level and start with the professional development at that level. And obviously we can't stop there. I have been really privileged to lead some professional development for teachers and paraprofessionals in the district. And I do think that staff are very, very responsive to it, and they do want to know what the right thing is to do. And we just need to be held accountable that we don't stop with teachers and paraprofessionals, or we don't only focus on secondary and not elementary, let alone early childhood, but that it really hits all of our stakeholders. And that's something that we need to be held accountable to do.
I'm also reminded that when we did the policy work, we also got some very specific components from our scholars that they really felt would be beneficial for their teachers at the time that they offered the feedback. But they really felt that those adults in their lives needed to know and to really be educated on based on their own experiences. And we really thought about, does that become part of the policy? Is that part of the guidebook? Is that part of the training material? And I think when we speak of evolution, to me, that's really next. How do we use that information? How do we gather that information to make sure that we are inclusive of the scholar voice and educating and empowering our staff to support the engagement of our learners to be more inclusive in the Hopkins schools. So I appreciate the insight, agree 100%. And now it's about making sure we have the right training opportunities, the training experiences, and put that as a part of our dedicated professional development. We've opened conversations as well with Director Erdl in our Innovation, Design, and Learning section of our programming to make sure that we can, as that oversees professional development, so that we can start deepening that professional development and intentionality with what that looks like for over the course of the summer and the next school year as well.
So I haven't seen any other community comments, questions, or concerns come through. So, super thankful for, the input on language, the continued engagement on how we implement. It's going to continue to be really important. I believe that the link to the Google form will stay active as well. So if there is something that comes up that you want answered, I'll go back and check that a little bit later this evening. But I also urge anyone with any additional questions to reach out directly to the school board. Dr. Lightfoot is available. Again, the members of the school board that are on the policy monitoring committee are myself, Katie O'Shea Peterson, Shannon Andreessen, who's the vice chair of the school board, and John Kuhl. So the three of us are the ones that on a regular basis are reviewing these policies. Shannon also heads up the Equity and Inclusion Student Advisory Council. If your students or anyone would like to participate in that as well, it does run from 7th grade through 12th grade. And those students are actively involved in helping us as a board create policy that reflects their needs. And then making sure that, as both Laura and Nick said, we stay really vigilant in making sure that we continue to evolve these policies to support our students as times change. So I am going to check one more time, but let Laura and Nick, if you would like to say a couple words as we wind down, and I'll just interrupt if I see any other questions come in.
Laura, any final comments you would offer?
No, the only thing I would just reiterate is I am very grateful for this policy, that it's moving through the process. I think that this will very positively impact not just our transgender, gender nonconforming students or our families who are in our district who maybe identify that way. I really think it will have a transformative impact on all of our students and our community. And just exactly what Katie, you just said about needing to make sure that we just hold each other accountable to make sure that the training, the professional development, that it continues to evolve.
I think a couple closing comments that I think speak so clearly to me over the years of doing policy is that sometimes policy comes because the legislature demands it or feels that, there are specific reasons for it. And it becomes a very legalistic, very prescriptive, really kind of almost a recitation of statute. And for me, the experience in being a part of this process has been that truly the inclusion of student voice at the level that is apparent in the work that has gone into this is incredibly powerful. And to know that Vision 2031 in the Hopkins schools engages scholar voice and looks to have it go even further than it exists right now is incredibly encouraging. And that this can be a primary step in moving this work forward and knowing that our entire organization will benefit from the deeper level of inclusion that we can do with scholar voice is incredibly affirming. So just as again, a thank you to all who have been involved and an encouragement of all who have not involved but want to get involved, that there is an opportunity to be at the table as we continue the work. So thanks and appreciation.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. I think we'll call that a wrap. I think we covered it. Thanks, Ivor and Steve, for your help on the technical side, and Nick and Laura for being here to help support the community's questions. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks to you.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks, Kate.